Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology. We had covered up to today 35 lectures, and today we are in the 36th lecture. We are touching the middle of the 20th century in discussing the history of psychology. If you remember, we started from about 2 to 300 years before Christ. We touched upon the ancient, the medieval, then of course the history. In the ancient reference, we talked about the old Greeks and the old subcontinental. Then we went into describing European, and then the American contribution, and then after those three earth-shaking revolutions, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Bolshevik Revolution, we came into the 20th century and saw the influence of these revolutions on the development of man's thought, in particular reference to the development of psychology. फिर हमने recent times में, relatively recent times में, जो एक बड़ा माहिर नफ्सियात है, उसका असर देखा था, and that was Sigmund Freud. And in his context we saw a number of psychologists who developed, who furthered his ideas, who later broke away from him. In discussing those psychologists, we were on two Americans that were influenced by what Freud had said in Europe and their contribution to psychology, which is a milestone in psychology. We saw the influence of those two American psychologists. One of them was, if you remember, Erich Fromm, and the other one was, do you remember? Karen Horney. We talked about these two, and we had touched upon Karen Horney's later theory in the 35th lecture, and we had also reviewed Erich Fromm's ideas related to his theory of personality and his theory related to neurosis. Before we go further today, let us review what we covered in the last lecture. We had talked about Karen Horney, and in the last lecture we reviewed a list that she had prepared of needs that he called neurotic needs, that in her system, in her thinking, influenced human behavior to a great extent. और उसका ये ख्याल था कि ये नीड जो हैं ये हर शख्स में मौजूद हैं, और इन्हीं की बिना पर एक शख्स जो है वो किसी ज़हनी या ज़हनी मसाइल की तरफ माइल होता है. And what are those needs that she talks about? Number one, if you remember, she talked 10 needs. Number one was the need for approval, as you are seeing it on your screen. The other was the need for domination. Another one was the need to confine life. Another was to be independent, autonomy. Another one was to achieve perfection. In my own personal view, which is a very small view, one of the important ingredients of our unhappiness is what she had pointed out, the need for perfection. We are driven, some of us are driven by this need. We want to be perfect in all the things that we do, in every way that we express ourselves. And since we are imperfect, मैंने आपसे पहले भी गुजारिश की थी कि सिर्फ ज़ात बारी ताला ही हर तरह से मुकम्मल है, इंसान तो imperfect ही है. So the need for perfection is a source of a lot of worry and unhappiness in people. That is the fifth need that she talked about. Then the sixth need that she talked about was the need for power. The seventh one was related to the need for power, the need to exploit others. एक तो है कि दूसरों पे अपनी धौंस जमाना, अपने आप को बड़ा साबित करना, और उसके साथ ही एक नीड है उनकी कमज़ोरी का, उनकी मोहताजी का फ़ायदा उठाना. And that is what she calls exploiting others, a neurotic need. And then there is the eighth need that she talked about, the need for prestige. The ninth need of ambition. मैंने आपको शेक्सपियर की एग्जाम्पल दी थी. Lady Macbeth talking to Macbeth in one of the tragedies of Shakespeare says that ambition is a kind of a sickness. And she says to her husband, Lady Macbeth to her husband, art not thou without ambition, but without the sickness to attend it. That ambition is a sickness, and that sickness, when it takes you over, takes somebody over, that is what Karen Horney is also talking about. The need of ambition being a neurotic need. And then, of course, the 10th need that she talks about is the need for admiration. दूसरों से अपनी तारीफ चाहना, ये भी एक ऐसी नीड है जो कैरन हॉर्नी के ख्याल में neurotic need है. Then she talked about these needs giving rise to 3 trends in our life, in our social dealing. And those trends, you remember the 3 of them? Movement towards people, being submissive and weak and meek, हर वक्त लोगों की खुशनुदी हासिल करने की तरफ माइल रहना. That is movement towards people. Then she talks about the other neurotic trend as movement away from people. लोगों को अवॉइड करना, उनके नज़दीक ना जाना, उनसे बातचीत ना करना. Somebody who's a recluse, जो दुनिया को त्याग के छोड़ दे, that would be described as somebody who, in Karen Horney's point of view, has moved away from people. And then the third one was, as you remember, movement against people. Somebody who is always in clash with other people. वो लोगों से मुकाबला और लोगों को नीचा दिखाने की कोशिश में ही मसरूफ़ रहता या रहती है. And that is the third movement that she thought people had. She also talked about, if you remember, 2 levels or 2 kinds of neurosis. ज़हनी बीमारियों की उसने 2 अक़साम बताई हैं. याद रहे कि ज़हनी बीमारियां हमने कहा था कि अगर हम तमाम ज़हनी बीमारियों का अहाता करें तो दे फॉल इनटू 2 मेन कैटेगरीज. वैसे तो 5-7 कैटेगरीज बनती हैं उनकी, लेकिन 2 मेन कैटेगरीज, न्यूरोसिस एंड साइकोसिस. न्यूरोसिस वो, साइकोसिस वो जो ज़्यादा शदीद हैं और न्यूरोसिस वो जो कम शदीद हैं. सो कैरन हॉर्नी इज टॉकिंग अबाउट neurosis, those mental diseases which are less severe, less chronic. And she says there are 2 types of those neuroses. One is what she calls situational neurosis, and the other is what she calls character neurosis. आप जानते हैं situational neurosis वो है जो किसी हंगामी हालत की वजह से एक शख्स में कोई मसाइल पैदा करे या उसकी ज़हनी हालत को ख़राब कर दे. अगर किसी शख्स को कारोबार में नुकसान हो जाए, अगर किसी स्टूडेंट को अपने इम्तिहान से पहले एंग्जाइटी, तशवीश लाहक हो जाए, तो दिस इज़ एन एग्जाम्पल ऑफ सिचुएशनल न्यूरोसिस. एंड देन शी टॉक्ड अबाउट कैरेक्टर न्यूरोसिस. अगर एक शख्स नुकसान न होने की वजह से भी उसको अपनी तिजारत में फ़ायदा ही है, कारोबार में फ़ायदा ही है, लेकिन फिर भी वो उदास है. एक शख्स, एक स्टूडेंट जो है, उसका इम्तिहान नहीं है, उसका इम्तिहान ख़त्म हो गया है और उसको तशवीश नहीं होनी चाहिए, एंग्जाइटी नहीं होनी चाहिए, लेकिन उसको फिर भी एंग्जाइटी है. सो दीज आर एग्जाम्पल ऑफ व्हाट शी कॉल्ड कैरेक्टर न्यूरोसिस. That was Karen Horney's contribution that we talked about. Remember, she was a trained psychoanalyst. She had her training in classical psychoanalysis, and she worked in the Freudian method for a number of years. लेकिन उसके बाद उसने क्लासिकल साइकोएनालिसिस को ख़त्म किया, छोड़ दिया, and she established her own system. Let us take a look at another prominent person at the American continent that we had talked about in the last lecture. Let us quickly review him before we move forward. And that was, do you remember, Erich Fromm? Erich Fromm had said that people want to be free, that people also want to belong. And this dichotomous, conflicting demand of being free and the desire to belong also creates different types of orientations, creates problems for people. And he had talked about 5 orientations. Do you remember those 5 orientations or 5 ways of behavior that he had talked about? Number 1, the receptive orientation, somebody who is meek and submissive. Then the exploitative orientation, somebody who wants to dominate and take advantage of others. 3, hoarding orientation, somebody who is miserly or very strict and stringent in his attitude. And number 4, marketing orientation, somebody who, without questioning whether that is right or wrong for him to be, he adopts the given way of life. That is the marketing orientation. And Fromm had said that all 4 of these are abnormal orientations. The 5th one that he talked about was productive orientation, which is a healthy orientation, जिसमें एक शख्स जो है वो अपनी ज़ात और अपने इर्द गिर्द के माहौल में मुताबिकत पैदा कर लेता है. That is the productive orientation. I pointed out to you that Fromm in his later life became more of a social philosopher and less of a psychiatrist. He lectured and he wrote extensively, but he practiced a little. These are the 2 prominent psychologists who were impressed by Freudian thought and Freudian method of analysis, but went on to develop their own systems on the North American continent. Let us go forward of this and let us take a look at 2 or 3 other prominent psychologists in the development of history of psychology. The first amongst these is Erik Erikson. As you can see on your screen also, he was born in 1902 and he died in 1994, only 12 years ago, only some years ago, only a decade ago. His contribution to psychology relates mainly to his discovery of development of human beings. एक अपनी जिंदगी के दौरान कैसे डेवलप करता है. आपको याद है, when we were talking about Freud, we had talked about Freud's contribution, and he had said that people go through stages of psychosexual development. Erikson rejected that view. He thought that people do develop. Psychology keeps on changing of a person as a function of passage of time, but the development is not psychosexual, the development is psychosocial. What's the difference here? The difference is that Freud had been talking about the development of a person in terms of his sex drive, whereas Erik Erikson is talking of development of a person in terms of his social dealing or her social dealing with the people that are around him, with the society at large. And that is the basic difference. If you notice, we had talked about Fromm and Horney, and now we are talking about Erikson. Although they were impressed with Freud's point of view, but all three of them, if you have noticed, are talking about the impact of the group, the impact of society, the impact of social factors on individual's development, on individual's psychology, on individual's mental diseases. They do not assume, as almost all prominent people that we talked about in regard to development of psychology of a person and the development of his disease, that a person develops as if the social factors do not play an important part. Whereas these three that we are talking about, Horney, Fromm, and Erikson, stress, emphasize the influence of social factors on an individual and the role that social factors play in the determination of a psychology of a person. Erik Erikson talks about a number of stages of a person's development, and his stages are, as you can see on your screen, number 1, trust versus mistrust. जब बच्चा पैदा होता है एरिक्सन के ख्याल में, और जब तक वो 1.5 या 2 साल का होता है, तो वो जिस स्टेज में है उस स्टेज को एरिक्सन ट्रस्ट वर्सेस mistrust की स्टेज है. First 1 to 2 years of one's life is the first stage of development in Erikson's theory. What happens here? The child is suspicious and fearful. उसको डर लगता है क्योंकि वो डिपेंडेंट है और वो सस्पिशियस है, इसलिए वो एडल्ट्स पर भरोसा भी करता है लेकिन उसके साथ साथ भरोसा नहीं भी करता. So that is his first explanation of the stage of development, trust versus mistrust. The second stage that Erikson talks about is what he calls autonomy versus doubt. 2 और 3 बरस की उम्र में बच्चा जो है उसमें ये ख्वाहिश पैदा होती है कि वो ऑटोनमस हो, वो भागे फिरे. Modern child psychologists consider this stage, call this stage to be terrible twos. When a child, in the point of view of modern developmental psychologists, reaches the age of 2 years, that is what they call terrible two. क्योंकि इस वक्त बच्चा जो है उसमें ऑटोनमी, एज एरिक्सन हैज पॉइंटेड आउट, उसमें ये ख्वाहिश है कि वो बहुत ज़्यादा आज़ादी फ़िक्र अमल इख्तियार करे. लेकिन हमारा बिहेवियर उन बच्चों के साथ जो है, हमारा से मुराद एडल्ट्स का, उसकी वजह से बच्चों में डाउट और शर्म भी पैदा हो जाती है. सो द सेकंड स्टेज इन एरिक्सन्स डेवलपमेंटल stages is what he calls autonomy versus doubt. The third stage is initiative versus guilt, is between 4 to 5 years. And this is when the child wants to take the initiative, but when he takes the initiative, he also feels guilty. उसको एहसास जुर्म भी होता है. वो कुछ ऐसी चीज़ें कर जाता है एरिक्सन के ख्याल में जो उसको उसके एहसास जुर्म को जन्म देती हैं. So this is what he is talking about, the stage of chronological years between 4 to 5 years. The next stage that he talks about is what he calls industry versus inferiority. Now the child is between the ages of 6 to 11 years. He wants to be industrious. वो मेहनत करना सीखता है, वो मेहनत की तरफ तवज्जो देता है. Depending upon the attitude of the elders, he also develops a feeling of inferiority if his attitude towards industry is overly criticized. अगर उसके एरिक्सन के ख्याल में अगर उस बच्चे को ज़रूरत से ज़्यादा नुक्ता चीनी का निशाना बनाया जाए तो इस स्टेज में बच्चा जो है वो इन्फीरियरिटी का भी शिकार हो सकता है. ये उसने, एज यू कैन सी, एरिक्सन ने क्या बात की है? ऑलमोस्ट एन एडलेरियन थिंग दैट ही इज टॉकिंग अबाउट, दैट इन्फीरियरिटी may develop at the age of 11 years. The next stage that Erikson talks about in development of human beings is what he calls identity versus role confusion state. Identity versus role confusion stage. इस स्टेज में बच्चा तकरीबन 12 से 18 बरस की उम्र में है और वो उसकी अपनी कुछ न कुछ शनाख्त जो है वो बन जाती है, लेकिन शनाख्त के साथ साथ उसको अपने रोल के बारे में भी, अपने किरदार के बारे में भी कोई कंफ्यूजन रहता है. और यहाँ जो है वो बड़े बूढ़े उसकी मदद कर सकते हैं. उसका कंफ्यूजन उसके रोल के बारे में दुरुस्त कर सकते हैं. बाप का रोल इस स्टेज पे ये है कि वो बेटे को अपना जैसा या अपने भाइयों जैसा या आइडियल मर्द जैसा बनाने की कोशिश करे. और माँ का रोल इस स्टेज ऑफ डेवलपमेंट में ये है कि वो अपनी बच्ची को अपने जैसी, अपनी बड़ी बहनों जैसी या आइडियल खातून की तरह बनाने की कोशिश करे. तो उससे उसका रोल कंफ्यूजन जो है वो कम होगा, ख़त्म होगा. द नेक्स्ट स्टेज दैट एरिक्सन टॉक्स अबाउट इज व्हाट ही कॉल्स इंटीमेसी वर्सेस आइसोलेशन. दिस इज द एज व्हेन द चाइल्ड is now into late adolescence. He wants intimacy. He wants to share confidences. There are stresses and storms within his body. Hormonal changes are taking place in his body or her body. As a result of that, there are many feelings that are born in the body, and the child, the young adult, the adolescent, has many questions to ask, many things to share. And this is the stage where this child wants intimacy, that he or she should be able to share her concerns or his concerns. But this intimacy, if is not available, then it may result in isolation, withdrawal. The child or the young adolescent may feel isolated, may feel taken away. And the next stage that Erikson talks about is what he calls generativity versus self-absorption. Generativity means getting involved with other than one's own self and one's immediate circle of family. And opposed to that is self-absorption, that the person focuses too much of his energy and time upon himself or herself. And this is that Erikson is talking about. And the last stage in the theory of Erikson's developmental stages is what he calls integrity versus despair. At the end of one's life, when one is mature, or at the mature years in one's life, the person can look back and integrate his experiences into a whole, into a nice pattern, and feel comfortable and feel the glow of what he has achieved in his past life. Or he can end up in despair if he feels that he hasn't lived the way he should have, or his ideal should have lived, ideal way of life. He has not had the opportunity to spend his life in an ideal way, then he ends up in despair. And this is the last stage that Erik Erikson talks about. Notice one thing in addition to what I pointed out in contrast to his theory of developmental stages, in contrast to Freud, that he is talking about developmental stages in terms of psychosocial development. Also notice one thing, that he is talking about development throughout one's life. It is not as if development has stopped or he has not elaborated his view about development. In stages of development में आपने नोट किया होगा कि stage of development, the early part of life, that is an important contribution of Erikson's, that he separated the developmental stages taking place up to adolescence or adulthood, and then beginning adulthood onwards, he talks about other stages. ये इसकी मेरे ख्याल में एक important contribution है. Let us go forward of Erik Erikson and let us take a look at another prominent psychologist who was a European but who migrated to America, remained in New York, worked in New York for a long, long time, and developed his own theory and system. His name was J.L. Moreno. He was inspired by Freud's theories and his methodology, but he criticized Freud very severely, also on the basis of emphasis on sexuality as a major. Freud put emphasis on those he called sexuality as determined behavior, and he also thought that Freud had no group influence, the social influence, the influence of the family on a person's development and the creation of his neurosis. And that is Moreno's main criticism of Freud. Let us take a look at Moreno's theory. There are a number of things which are interesting. His concept of spontaneity. He put forward the view that a person's mental health, that a person's entire development, that a person's entire being is related to, is a function of what he called spontaneity. Spontaneity का उर्दू तर्जुमा हम बेसाख्तगी करेंगे. बेसाख्तगी मोरेनो के ख्याल में हमारी नफ्सियात का बहुत ही अहम हिस्सा है, और अगर एक शख्स में बेसाख्तगी ना हो या अगर उसकी बेसाख्तगी कम हो जाए तो फिर मोरेनो के ख्याल में वो शख्स ज़हनी बीमारियों का शिकार हो सकता है, हो जाता है. और इस बेसाख्तगी को बढ़ाने के लिए, इस बेसाख्तगी को एक्सपेंड करने के लिए मोरेनो ने बहुत से तरीके इख्तियार किए. एंड वन ऑफ द मेजर psychological method that he developed was what he called psychodrama. Psychodrama is a drama, but there is no script in the drama. Let me explain what psychodrama is. Number one, psychodrama has a stage. जैसे आपने ड्रामा देखा होगा, उसी तरह की साइकोड्रामा की स्टेज भी है. इसके अलावा साइकोड्रामा में ड्रामे की तरह मेन एक्टर होते हैं ड्रामे में, इसी तरह से साइकोड्रामा में एक डायरेक्टर भी है, एक एक्टर भी है, एक से ज्यादा एक्टर्स भी हैं. तो पहले इन तीन चीज़ों का ज़रा थोड़ा सा तफसीली मुतालिया करते हैं. स्टेज जो है वो उसी तरह की स्टेज है जिस तरह की ड्रामे की स्टेज है इन मोरेनो's method of treatment of mental disorder that he called psychodrama. The actor on the psychodrama stage is called a protagonist. As you can see on your screen, the protagonist is a main character. The only thing with the protagonist or the main actor is that he does not have a script. वो अपने रटे रटाए जुमले या डायलॉग नहीं बोल रहा, बल्कि वो अपनी जिंदगी, अपनी ख्वाहिशात, अपनी फियर, अपनी विशेस के मुताबिक एक मुकालमा, एक डायलॉग बोल रहा है. जो उसके जी में आ रहा है वो बोल रहा है, स्पॉन्टेनियसली, बेसाख्तगी के साथ. डायरेक्टर जो है वो उसको बेसाख्ता होने की तरफ माइल कर रहा है और चाह रहा है, उसको डायरेक्ट कर रहा है कि प्रोटैगनिस्ट जो है वो उस स्क्रिप्ट को, जो उसकी जिंदगी की स्क्रिप्ट है, उसको खुल के बयान करे। तो ये है स्टेज, ये है प्रोटैगनिस्ट और ये है ए डायरेक्टर इन साइकोड्रामा। इसके अलावा स्टेज पर कुछ और एक्टर्स भी हैं जिनको मोरिनो ऑक्सिलरी ईगो कहता है। ऑक्सिलरी ईगो or egos are other characters who are playing other roles. The protagonist decides who is going to be another actor and what role he or she is going to play. He might select somebody from the audience to play the role of his mother, and then he invites her on the stage. The protagonist invites her on the stage, explains what his mother is like, and expects that person to play the role of the mother. Again, that woman is supposed to play that role spontaneously, without a script. So there is this protagonist and there is this auxiliary ego playing these roles. And there is this director who is directing the roles that these people are playing, except these roles are not written, they are created spontaneously. And then there is the role of the audience. The audience may tell the auxiliary ego or may tell the protagonist how to play the role, how to act or not to act. And that is the role of the audience. The other thing in psychodrama is role playing. अभी मैंने role playing का जिक्र किया. The auxiliary ego is playing a role, वो किरदार अदा कर रहा है जो प्रोटैगनिस्ट उसको बता रहा है, जो डायरेक्टर उसको डायरेक्ट कर रहा है, लेकिन वो बेसाख्तगी से वही रोल प्ले कर रहा है. इससे ऑक्सिलरी ईगो में, मोरिनो के ख्याल में, एक इंसाइट पैदा होती है टू बी स्पॉन्टेनियस. इसी तरह से डायरेक्टर में टेल द प्रोटैगनिस्ट टू रिवर्स द रोल विद द ऑक्सिलरी ईगो. जो मेन कैरेक्टर है, जिसको प्रोटैगनिस्ट कहा है हमने, वो अपना रोल प्ले कर रहा है, लेकिन डायरेक्टर उससे कहे कि तुम अब ये रोल प्ले मत करो, तुम अपने वालिद या वालदा का रोल प्ले करो. इससे क्या होगा? मोरिनो के ख्याल में रोल प्लेइंग से और रोल रिवर्सल से इंसाइट पैदा होती है. पीपल कैन सी what is right and what is wrong in what they are doing. That creates a larger understanding in themselves and in understanding social relations that exist between people. And this, in Moreno's point of view, is the road to recovery. This, in Moreno's methodology, is what he calls psychodrama. Psychodrama is a dramatic presentation of the point of view of a person in a spontaneous way. बेसाख्तगी के साथ वो एक शख्स जो है, वो अपने ख्यालात और तसव्वुरात, अपने एहसासात का इजहार करता है. और इसी तरह से मोरिनो के ख्याल में लोग जो हैं वो अपने मसाइल को और दूसरों के मसाइल को समझने के काबिल बनते हैं, और इसी बिना पर वो अपनी ज़हनी बीमारी से निजात हासिल कर सकते हैं. दिस इज़ ए रेडिकली डिफरेंट पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू फ्रॉम व्हाट वी हैव बीन डिस्कसिंग सो फार. रिमेंबर, वी हैड बीन सीइंग पीपल being treated in clinic in a one-to-one situation, whereas in Moreno's method we have moved out of the clinic and into the theaters. Of course, a specially made theater called a theater of psychodrama, but it is a radically different situation from a clinic, where the patient is either lying on the couch and the therapist is sitting behind him, or the patient is sitting across the table and the therapist is sitting in front of him discussing his problems with him. Here in Moreno's methodology of psychodrama, the patient, the person, the protagonist is acting out his actual neurosis on the stage with the help of a stage, with the help of a director, with the help of the auxiliary egos, and with the help and cooperation of the audience. Moreno had pointed out that he has been able to treat 30% of psychotics using this methodology. It's a very tall claim. याद है आपको psychotics में और neurotics में क्या फ़र्क है? Psychotics are people who suffer from more severe mental disorders, whereas neurotics are people who suffer from relatively less severe mental disorders. And Moreno put forward the claim that using his psychodramatic methodology, he could treat 30% of psychotics. Moreno also developed another technology of studying group phenomena, and that he called sociometry. Sociometry is measurement of what is taking place in a group. The feelings of people in a group for each other affect the group processes, the group activity as a whole. Organizational psychologists had discovered in the early 20th century that whatever mutual feelings exist in a group, in an industry, those mutual feelings in that particular group affect the productivity of that group in the industry, such that if people in an industry, in a group, like each other, their productivity is higher as a group as compared to another group where people do not like each other. Moreno developed the method of measuring those feelings that exist between group members. We use the concept of group cohesion to describe the mutuality of feelings that lies in a group. Group cohesion, many researchers have shown in the late 20th century that group cohesion is related to a number of factors in the group. That group cohesion, people's liking for each other in the group, influences productivity of the group as a whole, that it lowers the mental disease in a group. If people in a group like each other, then people in that group are less likely to become mentally sick. And Moreno's other contribution was, in this context, to discover those interpersonal feelings that lie within a group. And this he called sociometry. You will discuss these and you will talk about these and you will know about these more in social psychology. Hopefully I have touched upon this for you to understand. What is sociometry? Sociometry is, in Moreno's point of view, a measure of group phenomena. That was another important contribution of Moreno's in the realm of social psychology, apart from his contribution in the realm of treatment of mental diseases. So Moreno is remembered as a person who invented the technique of psychodrama and who invented and perfected the technique of sociometry. These two techniques are very, very important and very, very prominent in the modern technology of organizational behavior and in the modern technology of treatment of mental disorders. Before we end today, let us recapture what we had talked about. Today, we talked about two prominent American psychologists. One, Erik Erikson. We talked about Erich Fromm in reference to the last lecture. Today, we talked about Erik Erikson. And we talked about Erik Erikson in relation to his contribution to the development of a person, the psychological development of a person. He talked about the first stage of development, which is trust versus mistrust. The second stage, autonomy versus doubt. The third stage, initiative versus guilt. The fourth stage, industry versus inferiority. The fifth stage, identity versus role confusion. The sixth stage, intimacy versus isolation. The seventh stage, generativity versus self-absorption. And the eighth stage, integrity versus despair. ये सारी स्टेजेस जो हैं, ये तमाम उम्र चलती रहती हैं एरिक्सन के ख्याल में. दूसरा प्रोमिनेंट साइकोलॉजिस्ट जिसका आज हमने जिक्र किया है, that was J.L. Moreno. By the way, I once wrote a paper in the area of sociometry, which was published in one of the very leading journals that he printed. And I was flattered to receive a note by J.L. Moreno saying that we received the brilliant paper by Mr. Hashmi, and that we are planning to publish it in one of our journals. It has been published. It was later reported in a number of textbooks which are taught now in the United States and Canadian universities. That was related to sociometry. Let us talk about what we saw in relation to Moreno today. Moreno's point of view we discussed in relation to two things, very prominent two things that he pointed out. Number one was his concept and development of psychodrama. Psychodrama was a technology that he invented and developed and perfected to treat mental disorders. And number two, we talked about his methodology and usage of what he called sociometry. Sociometry is, as I pointed out, the measure of group dynamics. He invented and he discovered how group dynamics can be identified, can be measured. आपको याद है ग्रुप डायनामिक्स का एक रेफरेंस मैं पिछला भी आपको याद कराऊं. We talked about Kurt Lewin. Do you remember his contribution? Kurt Levin's contribution in relation to the Gestalt school. Kurt Lewin ने ही हमारी तवज्जो ग्रुप डायनामिक्स की तरफ मबजूल कराई थी. ये J.L. Moreno के सर पे सेरा बांधना चाहिए that he was the person who developed methodologies for measuring in a scientific manner, in an arithmetical and mathematical manner, the phenomena of group dynamics. If there are people, as I pointed out to you, who like each other in a group, that group tends to perform better than another group where people don't like each other. How do you measure this? This is what sociometry was all about. He measured it in terms of what he called tellies. T-E-L-E, telly. Telly to him was a kind of a symbol for a relationship of the chosen one. Somebody that was liked by one person was supposed to be in a telly relationship with that person. And This is how Moreno measured group dynamics in terms of tallies, in terms of the existing relationship amongst people. He talks of tallies in terms of negative and positive tallies. Negative tally is one where people in a group reject the other person in a group, do not like the other person in a group. And a positive tally is where people accept the other person in a group, where people like the other person in a group. He had shown, as I pointed out to you earlier, that if there are more positive tallies in a group than negative tallies in the group, then that group where there are positive tallies more than negative tallies, that group is more productive. अभी इसको थोड़ा सा आगे चलें, इसको अगर हम अपनी क्रिकेट या हॉकी या फुटबॉल की टीम पे अप्लाई करें तो हम इसको ऐसे समझेंगे कि अगर हमारे क्रिकेटर्स जो हैं वो आपस में एक दूसरे को इज्जत की निगाह से देखते हैं, एक दूसरे को पसंद करते हैं, एक दूसरे के लिए तहसीन के ख्यालात और जज्बात और एहसासात रखते हैं, तो ये क्रिकेट टीम या हॉकी टीम या फुटबॉल टीम हमारी जो है, ये किसी और फुटबॉल टीम से या क्रिकेट टीम से या हॉकी टीम से बेहतर परफॉर्मेंस देगी, इसलिए कि ये लोग एक दूसरे को पसंद करते हैं. इसी बात को मैं अगर थोड़ा सा और आगे बढ़ाऊं आपकी दिलचस्पी के लिए, वो टीमें, स्पोर्ट्स साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स हैव फाउंड दैट दोज टीम्स वेयर positive tallies exist perform better than those teams where positive tallies do not exist. If therefore sports psychologists argue, if you want your team to perform well, then you should create positive tallies in them. And this is the methodology this is the concept that Moreno was talking about. Creation of positive tallies and measurement of positive tallies through the method of sociometry. That is all for today. We'll pick up some more prominent psychologists in the next lecture. Until then, do revise, look up what we have talked today, and look after yourselves. Khuda Hafiz. God be with you.